Soldiers of the cross. Soldiers of Christ. Very appropriate. We sang that song because I'm about to introduce one.
Amen.
As a couple of the gentlemen mentioned, we've been doing this 5 years. When we first started, we didn't have it quite all ironed out. One minor thing we forgot to do the first time Pastor was here was invite his wife. Sorry about that, Alice. We've apologized before, but I just wanted to make it formal. Maybe you enjoyed the peace and quiet. I don't know. But we've developed a great friendship over the years. And Pastor Weaver, if you talk with him, you know he's a busy man. He travels a lot. And he is one of America's most sought-after pastors. He was called into the ministry in 1965. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in theology and attended graduate school at Bob Jones University. He has pastored and helped plant several churches and Christian schools. He has authored 3 books: The Christian Civil Government, The Sovereignty of God and Civil Government, and The Biblical Truth About God's Righteous Vengeance, all of which are on the back table for your purchase. Like Paul, his goal is to preach, and this is very important, the whole counsel of God. Something that is sadly missing in today's pulpits. Pastor Weaver is a distinguished graduate multiple times from Front Sight Firearms Training Institute, and also teaches the Front Sight methodology in his training classes, which some of you are going to participate in tomorrow. And I might add that Alice is not too shabby a shot either. I saw the target. So we appreciate your teaching, your friendship. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Pastor John Weaver.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. And, okay, I'll get it down. Thank you. When I was here 5 years ago, I couldn't wait to get back home to our church. And when I did, the first thing I told them, I said, "You're not going to believe this, but there are men from Mars." And they started looking at each other. I said, "Yes, they're real Martians. I have seen them and I have talked with them." And people again began to look at each other like, has he really flipped his lid, you know? And then I said, "No, they're just from the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, short for Mars, you know." And so then the people responded laughingly that yes, etc. An interesting thing today is I was waiting on Toby to pick us up, and I was reading an article, and I read about a scientist that just died. And he said that yes, Area 51 does have flying saucers. He said, yes, there are aliens, and yes, they're even working in our government. This guy has a not only an engineering degree, I mean, he worked for Hughes Aircraft, he worked for Lockheed Martin, and so I read that to Alice, and I kind of smiled, and I said, "You know, I believe in aliens." She looked at me. I said, "Well, the scripture says that we were strangers from the commonwealth of Israel, and we were aliens from the promises of God." And I said, "I do believe that many working in the government are aliens. They're alien from the covenant and the promises of God."
Right.
But that's true. It's interesting how so many people want to make things out of this world when in reality, we're in this world, and there's so much truth right before our eyes based upon the Word of God. Let me begin tonight by asking you to turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. I want to read just several verses, and then I'm going to ask several pertinent questions. Notice, if you would, Hebrews chapter 11, beginning there with verse 32. Hebrews 11, verse 32. The Word of God says, "And what shall I more say, for the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, David also, and Samuel of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of the lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. He says women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. So here's my question. Have things changed in your lifetime? I don't mind telling you, I'm 70 years of age. I have seen more changes since I was a boy than you can shake a stick at. And you look around today and you want to ask this question. Where are the people that love truth, that love righteousness, that love liberty, that love freedom? I know there's been a vast difference from the time when I was a boy until there is right now. But let me ask you another question. Have you thought of the difference, not only of the knowledge, but of the conviction and the character that existed in the founding of this country and where we are now? And if you've thought of the differences, my question would be, how did you analyze the differences and what would be your answers? I want to share with you tonight what I believe as one of the main problems that we have in this country. And I want to tell you what the answer really is before I finish. I want to bring a message which I've entitled The Black-Robed Regiment, which I will explain momentarily. But I just read Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 35, and I want to prove just certain simple truths. The very first truth should be obvious, and that is that God uses men. He names them. He certainly used Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and a multitude of other prophets. But I also want to point out, secondly, that God did not use those men just because they were men, and He did not use them just to glorify man. He used them to bring honor and glory to His name and also deliver His people. And I also want to point out, just simply by way of introduction, when God gave these names, and we understand what these people did and how they fought and how they lived, I believe in one sense of the word, it is to encourage us to do what the Scripture says when it says, "Quit ye like men and be strong." In other words, God is calling us to action as well. Now, the Black-Robed Regiment was the name that was given to the pastors, the ministers who sparked, who fought in, who prayed for, and who advanced what you and I would know as the American War for Independence, sometimes known as the American Revolution. Back then, all of the pastors normally wore long, flowing black robes. It's the Black-Robed Regiment. I've threatened, I've never done it, but one of these days I'm going to bring a message on the stealing of the robes. Because you will have to remember that originally it was the pastors that wore those long, black, flowing robes. And they did so as a symbol of their authority and of their office. But now the robes are gone from the pastors and they went to the university, and now they've gone from the university, and now the 9 Supreme Court justices wear them. Because those robes symbolize authority and jurisdiction. But it was these pastors who actually sparked and fought in the American War for Independence. And these pastors were despised, they were hated, and they were eagerly sought for by the British. Bounties were placed upon their head. And when they were captured, they were very cruelly treated and very quickly, many times, murdered. The name of Pastor Moses Allen of Georgia was cursed by the Tories. He was more obnoxious to the British, they said, than the leaders of the Patriots themselves. Hence, dire threats were issued against this godly pastor. In fact, his enemies said that this rebel parson did more injury to the cause of the king than a dozen militia colonels. And so, very obviously, they were after him. When Savannah, Georgia fell to the British, they made sure that they burned down the home of Moses Allen, as well as his church building in Midway, Georgia. It's interesting how you can go to Midway and you understand through the museum there some of the things that happened. Also, Pastor Moses Allen was captured by the British at that particular time. He was put on a British ship along with other American prisoners. They were all mistreated. They were basically being starved to death. And Pastor Allen ministered to the men on the prison ship until he got the opportunity to escape. And the only way he could escape would be to dive off the ship into the water and swim to shore. Well, his escape was very successful. The only problem was he was so malnourished and had been so evilly treated that he did not have actually the strength to make it to the shore. And so he drowned. Many of the American patriots began to beg that they would be allowed to go and bury this godly man. And the British just simply laughed and they said, "You want him buried? We'll bury him." So they sent some soldiers over, just stomped him down in the mud, left limbs sticking up for the buzzards to come and eat. So very obviously, these pastors were hated and they were despised by the British. Such pastors as Moses Allen and those like him flamed the desire for truth and liberty and freedom. They also put the flame of piety in the hearts of many, many individuals. Many of these pastors themselves went into the army. They went in as chaplains. Some preached to the enemies. Others showered the entire country with pamphlets and with sermons. And some even fought with arms as a common soldier. It was these pastors that taught their hearers to reject the horrible doctrine of the divine right of kings. It was also these pastors that taught their people active resistance and against passive resistance and against just simply non-resistance. It was these pastors then that inculcated in the people of that day and time that truth and liberty and freedom all came from God. These were not gifts of government, they were gifts of God. And they also pointed out how government was ordained of God to protect these rights and to also preserve and establish God's law and God's orderly way. I don't care how much you study the American Revolution or the American War for Independence, you're going to find that these pastors were basically everywhere. You will find them hutted here at Valley Forge. You'll also find them facing the storm in the wintry march on Trenton. You'll also find them covered with the smoke and conflict at Bennington. You'll find them standing there under the enemy's fire at Yorktown. At Lexington, 3 pastors fought as common soldiers as well. You will find these pastors attached to every expedition, no matter how hazardous and no matter how exhausting. You'll find it was these pastors who were the spiritual magistrates that not only led their people, but taught their people in preaching and praying and fighting. Some of you heard Gad Hitchcock. I have a message on Gad Hitchcock. I was asked years ago to bring the message that Gad Hitchcock preached on May the 25th, 1774. It was an election sermon. And Pastor Gad Hitchcock had been asked to preach to the newly appointed governor that had been sent by George III, King of England. Well, of course, Pastor Hitchcock readily agreed. When Pastor Hitchcock arrived to preach the election sermon, oh my, he discovered that the newly appointed governor was General Gage. And General Gage had his army standing behind him. So, Gad Hitchcock then took his text from Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 2. And the Bible says there, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bear rule, the people mourn. And so Gad Hitchcock preached then to General Gage, who was the appointed governor, sent by George III. I want you to just listen to one paragraph that Gad Hitchcock preached, and remember, he's preaching to General Gage. He says this: "If I am mistaken in supposing plans are formed and executing subversive of our natural and chartered rights and privileges, and incompatible with every idea of liberty, all America is mistaken with me. Our continued complaints, our repeated humble but fruitless and unregarded petitions and remonstrances, and if I may be allowed the sacred illusion, our groanings which cannot be uttered, are at once indications of our sufferings, and the feeling that we have of them. Let the governor in the chair of state hear it. We not only mourn, but with groanings that cannot be uttered, all because the wicked bear rule. The castle, that is, King George's palace, the castle cannot shelter him from that scorching thunderbolt. Families are divided. Brother is arrayed against brother, friend against friend. Society is cut loose from its mooring, and hate and consternation reign on every side. And all because the wicked bear rule. King George may say that the evils that produced in this state are things that are imaginary. But I tell you, said Gad Hitchcock, I tell you to General Gage, and I will tell the tyrant to his face, it's because the wicked bear rule. Can you imagine a preacher today addressing the governor of any state, or even the President of the United States, in such a manner? It's all because the wicked bear rule. You see, it was these preachers who preached liberty. They were bold, they were brave, they were courageous, they were very influential. And the British were very upset because they saw that the authority and the influence of these pastors was on the side of independence, and they were alarmed. And they said that these pastors then were fostering rebellion. May I tell you something about rebellion according to the Bible? Rebellion can only be to lawful authority. Where there is no lawful authority, it is not rebellion, it is resistance. Rebellion can only be to lawful authority. In 1774, the British governor of Massachusetts refused the request of the Massachusetts Assembly to appoint a prayer and fast day. And so all they were wanting to do was this. Look, we've got problems. We know we're headed to war, probably. Let's have a prayer and fast day. Well, the governor of Massachusetts refused to allow that. And here's what he said, and I'm quoting. He said the request for a prayer and fasting day was only to give an opportunity for sedition to flow from the pulpit. Now I want you to notice what the tyrant says. He's referring to truth and liberty as sedition. And he calls refusal to submit to tyranny rebellion. We have the same mentality today in this day and time. Let me tell you. Official governmental proclamations and sanctions and indictments do not change truth, nor do they change righteousness and justice. Governments may defame the truth, they may denounce the truth, they may deny the truth, but they can never destroy the truth. Because it is God's truth. One cannot change God, nor His Word. That's why Psalm 119 in verse 89 says, "Forever, O Lord, is Thy Word settled in the heavens." Now let me just give you very quickly the idea how most of the pastors during this day and time were for independence and were against the tyranny that was prevailing in government during that day. In fact, Dr. Timothy Dwight, who happened to be an author, a theologian, a chaplain, and the president of Yale University, he urged for a declaration of independence from England before the declaration was ever written. Here's what he said. "I urged in conversation with several gentlemen of great respectability, firm Whigs, and my intimate friends, the importance and even the necessity of a declaration of independence on the part of the colonies. For myself, I regarded the die as cast, and the hope of reconciliation vanished, and believed that the colonists would never be able to defend themselves unless they renounced their dependence upon Great Britain." So here's Dr. Timothy Dwight saying we must have independence. Some of you have heard of Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Dr. Jonathan Mayhew was actually the originator of the phrase, the Confederation, or a more perfect union. Robert Treat Paine called Dr. Mayhew the father of civil and religious freedom in Massachusetts and in America. John Adams called Dr. Mayhew the morning gun of the Revolution. The morning gun of the Revolution. On October the 25th, 1765, Dr. Mayhew preached a sermon against the Stamp Act of Galatians chapter 5, verses 12 and 13. The sermon was full of absolute divine truth, and of course about the nature and the exercise of civil government. George Bancroft, the historian, said this concerning Jonathan Mayhew. He said, Mayhew spent whole nights in prayer for the dangers of his country. Light dawned on his mind on the Sunday morning of July 1766 when he wrote James Otis saying, "You have heard of the communion of the churches. While I was thinking of this in my bed, the great use and importance of the communion of the colonies appeared to me in a very striking light. Would it not be decorous in our assembly to send circulars to all the rest expressing a desire to cement a union among ourselves? A good foundation has already been laid by the Congress of New York. It may be the only means of perpetuating our liberties. So the suggestion of a more perfect union for the common defense originated with Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, and the first public expression of that future union came to Dr. Mayhew on a Sunday morning as he lay in bed, prayed, and contemplating on the situation." Here were men who actually understood the times. These pastors were the leaders of the American War for Independence. They were the movers. They were the shakers. What I want to do very quickly tonight is this. I want to give you just a few names and just a few illustrations very quickly of some of these pastors and what they did. Some of you may have heard of Reverend John Woodall. He was the pastor of the Freehold Presbyterian Church of New Jersey. He was one of the most active pastors and most active preachers of his day. He embraced liberty and he embraced freedom so wholeheartedly that on one occasion, when the contest really got hot, every man in his church went out to battle with their pastor, except for one feeble old man who was unable to go, and even then he begged them Godspeed and said that he would keep them in prayer and pray as they fought. There was Dr. David Ely of Huntington, Connecticut, who was surrounded by Tories. And Dr. Ely was so hated because he preached independence and liberty and freedom so freely and with such conviction that even members of his own congregation said that when the rebellion was put down and the war was over, they would hang him from the oak tree closest to the church building. Joseph Fish, Pastor Joseph Fish of Duxbury, Massachusetts, who was 76 years of age when George Washington called upon him to speak to a group of men and encourage them to join the army. This 76-year-old preacher preached with such power and such anointing that when he concluded his message, he said this. Listen carefully. "Were it not that my nerves are unstrung and my limbs enfeebled with age, on such a call as you have, I think I should willingly quit the desk, put off my priestly garments, buckle on the harness, and with trumpet in hand, rush into battle." A 76-year-old man. Joseph Stearns of New Hampshire not only preached independence, he was a pastor, but he sacrificed most of his worldly goods to sustain it. When he came back from Exeter, his two grown sons asked him about the meeting. And he said this: "If the cause succeeds, that is the cause of liberty and independence, if the cause succeeds, it will be a great blessing to our country. But if it fails, your old father's head will soon be a button for a halter." And then he sent his two sons into the army and challenged them to strike manfully for freedom. John Mills of Delaware, though a nervous and timid man by temperament, yet he preached from 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 16, where the 10 northern tribes left Rehoboam and the two southern tribes. And they said, "To you, tents, O Israel, what portion do we have in David?" And he told the people there that that is exactly what America was doing. They were separating, they were seceding from the tyrant George III and from a tyrannical parliament. And he preached everywhere he went that truth. It was Dr. David Caldwell here in Pennsylvania who had his house and his library burned to the ground because he preached liberty and freedom and independence, and he lost his house and he lost his library without a sigh. Dr. Thomas Reed, here of Pennsylvania in 1776, shouldered his musket and with 40 or 50 others marched to Philadelphia to aid in defending it against General Howe. And the next year, this same pastor saved Washington before he was overwhelmed at Elk Ferry because of his knowledge of the country. There was Pastor Robert Davidson of Maryland, who addressed his people from 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and verse 22. "For many fell down slain because the war was of God." And he pointed out how this war was of God because of the truths and the principles that were involved. William Graham rather, of Paxton, which was near Harrisburg here, he saw the backwardness of his young men who were hesitating in volunteering into a militia company. And so what he did, he stepped up and had his name enrolled and chained all of his young men into joining. And thus they followed their pastor into battle. Pastor John Steele of Cumberland, Pennsylvania, served as captain and led the advanced company of 900 men on their march to the seat of war, and often preached with his gun standing by his side. Azel Rowe, another pastor, to make the militia in his area fight, he exposed himself to the enemy's fire and allowed the enemy to fire at him at will until he had chained his men into saying that if he would fight, they would fight. And when they said that they would fight, he stepped down and led them. Charles McKnight of Shrewsbury, another pastor, on account of his devotion to the cause of liberty and the gallant conduct of his patriotic sons on the battlefield, this pastor was thrown into prison and treated maliciously and wickedly and cruelly. And he was treated so badly that a short time after his release, he died. Dr. Samuel McClintock of Greenland, New Hampshire, was often represented in battle, especially at the Bunker Hill battle. And he had sent 4 of his sons into the army, and here he was the man who prayed over many of the fallen and many of the slain. Dr. Hezekiah Ripley, a friend of Washington, also heard that his home and his library had been burned, and he never gave one sigh of regret because he was standing for liberty and freedom. Joseph Martin, another pastor, after praying with the soldiers at Bunker Hill, seized a musket and fought valiantly with his men to the close of the battle. Right after that, he preached a message from Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 14, where Nehemiah said, "And I said unto the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not afraid of them." Ah, here he is. Nathaniel Bartlett of Reading, Pennsylvania, who was a chaplain for a while to General Putnam, was accustomed of making his parochial visits with a musket on his shoulder to protect himself from the British who had threatened him over and over with death. Here's a pastor. I could go on. All of these pastors were eager to fight and to stand for truth. However, there were just a few sometimes that hesitated. In fact, one of those individuals was a godly man by the name of Payson. And he was kind of timid, kind of hesitant, and he preached patience. And he preached basically wait and see, even almost to the point of submission. Some of the other pastors were incensed at his stand, and they refused to allow him to preach in their pulpits because they did not want anything like that preached to their people. And when the first blood of the colonists was shed at Lexington and Concord, this meek divine picked up his musket, placed himself at the head of a militia, marched out, encountered the British, poured such a devastating volley into the British soldiers that either they were all killed or those who were not were captured. So when the blood of the first American citizen was shed, this timid man became a real, honest fighter. Now, I could sit here tonight and give you illustration after illustration. Time will not allow me to do that. What I want to do is this. I want to pick out 4 or 5 men, and I want to tell you about these men, and I want you to think, as I talk about these pastors, and I want in your mind to compare them with the pastors that you know today. And let's see if there's a difference in the way pastors think and preach and the way we've been taught. The first one I want to tell you about is Thomas Allen. Thomas Allen was the brother of Moses Allen. English soldiers converged on the hills at the Battle of White Plain or Ticonderoga. The colonists were outnumbered and they were basically outgunned. And everybody knew this. Well, Pastor Thomas Allen then, since he was actually the leader of the militia, wanted to encourage not only his soldiers, but the other soldiers as well. So he began to preach a message to his soldiers and to all who would listen. Now I want you to listen just about 4 paragraphs of what Pastor Allen said. This is not his whole sermon, this is just part of it. Here's what he said. Valiant soldiers, yonder, pointing to the enemy that lay in sight, yonder are the enemies of your country who have come to lay waste and destroy and spread havoc and devastation through this pleasant land. They are enemies hired to do the work of death and have no motive to animate them in their undertaking. You have every consideration to induce you to play the man and to act the part of valiant soldiers. Your country looks up to you for its defense. You are contending for your wives, whether you or they shall enjoy them. You're fighting for your children, whether they shall be yours or theirs. Your houses and lands, for your flocks and herds, for your freedom and for future generation, for everything that is great and noble, on account of which only life itself is not worth a fig. You will abide the day of trial. You cannot give back while animated by these considerations. Suffer me therefore on this occasion to recommend to you without delay, to break off your sins by righteousness, and your iniquity by turning unto the Lord. Turn ye, ye ungodly sinners, for why would you die? Repent, lest the Lord come and smite you with a curse. Our camp is filled with blasphemers, and resounds with the language of the infernal regions. Oh, that officers and men might fear the name of our holy God. Oh, that you would now return to the Lord, lest destruction come upon you, lest vengeance overtake you. Oh, that you were wise, that you understood this in your latter end. I must recommend to you the strictest attention to your duty, and the most punctual obedience to your officers. Discipline and order and regularity are the strength of an army. Valiant soldiers, should our enemy attack us, now listen, should our enemy attack us, I exhort and conjure you to play the man. Let no danger appear too great. Let no suffering appear too severe for you to encounter for your bleeding country. God's grace assisting me, I am determined to fight and to die by your side rather than flee before the enemies or resign myself to them. Prefer death to captivity. Ever remember your unhappy brethren, made prisoners at Fort Washington, whose blood now crieth to heaven for vengeance, and shakes the pillars of the world, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not charge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? Rather than quit this ground with infamy and disgrace, I should prefer leaving this body a corpse on the spot. I must finally recommend it to you and urge it on you again and again, in the time of action, to keep silence. that all be hushed and calm, serene and tranquil, that the word of command may be distinctly heard and resolutely obeyed. And may the God of heaven take us all under His protection and cover our heads in the day of battle and grant us His salvation. Wow. Did you hear what this pastor say? God's grace assisting me, I am determined to fight and to die by your side rather than flee before our enemies or resign myself to them. Prefer death to captivity. Rather than quit this ground on the spot with infamy and disgrace, I should prefer leaving this body of mine a corpse. Oh, after Pastor Allen preached this tremendous sermon, had the men stirred up, ready to fight, the leaders of the army decided they would retreat. Pastor Allen was so frustrated, so ashamed of the action of the American army. It was later that General Stark called out the Berkshire militia, of which Pastor Allen was the head. It was the 16th of August. Pastor Allen got all of his militia together and marched straight to General Stark. Rather than messing around with the lower officers, Pastor Allen marched straight to the tent of General Stark. He told General Stark, the Berkshire militia has been called out numerous times and has not been allowed to fight. Now he said to General Stark, if you do not allow us to fight this time, we will never turn out again. General Stark, being a hero himself, was not angered by the young pastor, but rather amused. And so he looked at Pastor Allen, and by the way, it was dark. They got there at night. It was raining. General Stark looked at the young pastor and said, well, would you prefer to march now and tonight in the rain? Pastor Allen said, no, not tonight. Well, General Stark said, if the Lord is pleased to give us sunshine tomorrow, I promise you, you will have all the fighting that you desire. And sure enough, the next morning, the clouds were gone, the sun was shining. So Pastor Allen took his militia and went to the assigned spot. Some of the men said, Pastor Allen, it looks like we will do our own fighting today. Yes, said Pastor Allen, we'll have our turn at it. But we're not ready. The first thing we need to do is pray. And so he gathered all his men around him and prayed. And he was determined that if his example could make his men brave, he would do so. He was not going to be a coward. When the Hessians, that is the German soldiers who were hired by George III to fight, when they came into view, guess what Pastor Allen did? In his long flowing black robe, he ascended to a stump. And as on top of that stump, he looked at the Hessian soldiers and commanded them to surrender and throw down their weapons and save this effusion of blood. And he promised them peaceful conditions if they would surrender. Well, they answered with musket fire, whizzing by his head, one bullet going through his hat, and he then jumped off the stump and gathered his men together. The battle soon began shortly thereafter. He fought along beside his men. He had a brother, Joe, there, and he noticed that he was a much better shot than Joe. And so he looked at Joe and he said, Joe, you load and I'll shoot. And so Joe loaded for his pastor and his pastor shot. When the battle was over, or right before it was over, It was Pastor Thomas Allen who led his men over the breastworks. And he was the first one over the breastworks with his men behind him, chasing the Hessians. When the battle was over, he then captured a horse that had medical supplies. He then took those medical supplies and began to minister not only to his men, but to the other men and even to the wounded German soldiers as well. After all that was done, he hurried back to his church in order to preach the following Lord's Day. And of course, by this time, some of his people had heard that he had fought like a common soldier. One of his men came up to him and said, "Pastor, I heard that you fought like a common soldier. Is it true?" Pastor Allen answered, "Yes. It was a hard, hot battle, and it became every patriot to do his duty." But the man continued, "But Pastor Allen, did you kill anybody?" Well, Pastor Allen said, "I don't know whether I killed anybody or not. But he said, I noticed from a bush, a flash of fire would come, and every time that flash of fire would come, one of our men would fall. He said, so I aimed at that bush. He said, I don't know whether I killed anybody or not, but I put out that flash." Here was a man who fought. Did you know that Pastor Allen lived to 1810 and he died of natural causes at the age of 68? Where are the pastors like Thomas Allen today? Many of you may have heard of old Naphtali Daggett. I love Naphtali Daggett. He was not only pastor, he was also president of Yale College. He instructed his students on their duty not only to obey God, but their duty to resist tyranny and their duty to fight for liberty and freedom. Well, in 1779, General Tyrone, with 2,500 English soldiers, landed only 5 miles from West Haven. The little college was hurriedly broken up, and in order to give most of the people time to escape, there was a volunteer army of young college students, of 100 men, who agreed to fight to hold the English soldiers back to give the rest of the people enough time to escape. Well, there was a lot of confusion in the streets while the company of 100 young men were forming, and pretty soon they got everything together and they marched off toward the enemy with fife and drum. They had not gone down the road very long and very far until all of a sudden they heard the clatter of hoofbeats behind them. And they turned and looked, and here came old Dr. Naphtali Daggett riding his old black mare, and he kept going right straight through the company of the young college students, right toward the English. He finally found a hill. He went up on the hill. The young college students met the advance of the English soldiers and poured such a volley into them that they went back. And the young college students then began to chase the English soldiers. They chased them so hard and so fast, all of a sudden, they realized they were facing 2,500 professional soldiers. And so they then turned to disperse and to try to save their lives. As they left, and as they were running, they passed the hill and saw Dr. Daggett up top with his long fowling piece. And as they passed the hill, and as the English came into range, there was a shot. There was a pause, and another shot. Well, the English at first ignored it, because it was just a single weapon. But pretty soon, they noticed British soldiers were falling. So General Tyson sent one of his lieutenants up the hill and said, go see what's going on up there. Well, Dr. Daggett could have run any time. His old black mare was right there, but he didn't. Well, the lieutenant got to the top of the hill, and he saw Dr. Daggett in his long flowing black robe, coolly, calmly reloading his old fowling piece. The lieutenant was more amused than anything else. And the lieutenant looked at Dr. Daggett and he said this, "Why, you old fool, what are you doing here, firing at His Majesty's soldiers?" Dr. Daggett looked at him and said, "Exercising the right of war, son, exercising the right of war." What? He said, "You old fool," he said, "if I let you go, will you promise never to fire on the king's soldiers again?" Dr. Daggett said, "Nothing more likely, son, nothing more likely." At which, of course, the lieutenant then captured the old man, took him downhill, marched him back, threw him into prison. When he got out, he never recovered from his cruel treatment and died 16 months later. Here was a man that was not content to teach the principles of liberty and freedom to his students. He was going to apply them. He was a pastor, the president of Yale. Where are preachers like that today? Where are professors like that today? Everyone in this room probably knows of John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a pastor, a patriot, a congressman. He was also the president of Princeton College. Did you know that it was John Witherspoon and Roger Sherman who were responsible for the hard money clauses in our Constitution? "No state shall make anything but gold or silver." No. It was John Witherspoon, Roger Sherman who got that in there. When it came time for the Declaration to be signed, it was presented to the Congress. John Witherspoon arose and he said this, looking to the President of the Continental Congress, he said, "Mr. President, that noble instrument on your table, which ensures immortality to its author, should be subscribed this very morning by every pen in the House. He who will not respond to its accents and strain every nerve to carry into effect its provisions is unworthy of the name of free man. Although these gray hairs must descend into the sepulchre, I would infinitely rather they should descend thither by the hand of the executioner than desert at this crisis the sacred cause of my country." Did you hear that? He said, "I'd rather be executed by the king than pass by my country at this time of crisis." And he sat down. One of the members of the Congress stood up and said that he did not think that the country was ripe enough for such a Declaration of Independence. John Witherspoon stood back up and said, "Sir, this country is not only ripe, it is rotten, and it needs the Declaration of Independence." And of course, John Witherspoon was right. Some of you probably heard of a man by the name of James Caldwell. James Caldwell was a Presbyterian pastor. I have a sermon just on the life of James Caldwell. Oh, you talk about someone that suffered. Do you realize the British soldiers, walking by his house, saw his beautiful wife Hannah through the window with her new baby? And the English soldier lifted up his musket, shot Hannah Caldwell, killed her instantly. Thankfully, a neighbor was there and was able to take the baby and save the baby. James Caldwell had his house burned. He had his churches burned. James Caldwell had to preach with 2 loaded pistols on the pulpit. The British hated him so, had threatened his life so many times. It was James Caldwell during one battle where he saw the militia and the colonists fire slack because of the lack of wadding for those muskets. He rushed to the nearest Presbyterian meeting house, got the songbooks. Most of those hymns were written by Isaac Watts. And he ran back to where the men were fighting, tore the pages of the songbooks out, passed them out to the men, and as he did, he said, "There you go, boys. Put watts into them. Give them watts." And they used those song leaves for wadding for their muscles. Later, James Caldwell was shot dead himself by a British soldier. Unarmed, innocent, going to a ship to pick up a widow and escort her safely through. And he was just simply gunned down. Everybody in this room has heard of Jonas Clark. I hope you have. He was the pastor at Lexington. You know, everybody's heard about Lexington Green. You know, most people do not know that Lexington Green was the churchyard. Jonas Clark was a tremendous preacher. Sam Adams and John Hancock had often found asylum in his house. In fact, Jonas Clark had married the cousin of John Hancock. Jonas Clark had instructed and taught his people so well that they were not only of one mind with Jonas Clark, they knew what the Word of God said, they knew what the Word of God taught, but they even took his instructions and gave them to their representative, who put it in writing, and that is still in existence today. The instructions remain there, engrossed in the town records as a standing memorial, not only to his patriotism, but to the patriotism of his church. Warren had sent word that the English were coming. And by the way, I have a message. It's probably on sermon audio. I would challenge you to listen to it. The title of the message is The First Shot. The First Shot. You know, a lot of people say, well, we don't know who fired that first shot. Oh, yes, we do. There are eyewitnesses. And they gave eyewitness accounts. And it was the British who fired the first shot. Well, they heard the Britishers coming. So from about midnight to 1, they were trying to make preparations. Finally, at 2 in the morning, they began to ring the church bells. And 150 men of Pastor Clark's church and area turned out. Everyone answered to the roll call. They were gathered there on the church green. The British soldiers came upon them later on. They had stood around until daylight. When the British soldiers came, they saw these men were armed. Here came the orders. Throw down your weapons, you rebels! Throw down your weapons! And the next thing you know, a volley rings out. And when it does, weapons are fired on both sides. After the battle was over, Pastor Jonas Clark looked on the church green, and there lay 7 stalwart men who'd been taught and trained by himself. There lay Jonas Parker, the strongest wrestler in Lexington, who had just sworn that morning that he would never run from British ball or bayonet. And he kept his word, and he died on the spot. There too lay old Caleb Monroe, his gray hair dabbled in blood. And there lay Caleb Harrington, dead on the church house steps. Why was he shot on the church house steps? Listen carefully. Because he was running into the church building to get more powder and ball for the men. The powder and the ball were kept in the church house. When Jonas Clark saw his men, of course he was grieved and he was brokenhearted that they had died. Yet he was not ashamed of the principles that he taught. And he said this, "From this day will be dated the liberty of the world." From this day will be dated the liberty of the world. Everyone knows about April the 19th. Sam Adams and John Hancock wanted to know one thing from Pastor Jonas Clark: would his men fight? He said, yes, they will fight. I've taught them and I've trained them for this very hour. What in the world can the wicked do? What can a tyrant do with men who know the truth and are willing to stand and fight for truth? Let me give you one last. Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. I hope you would look him up. Pastor Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg was the pastor of the Protestant Episcopal Church in Dunmore County, Virginia. He told his people that afternoon he's going to preach a message that was very important. He wanted everybody to be there. The church building was packed. There he stood in his long flowing black robe. He preached from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time of war, there's a time of peace. There's a time of love, there's a time of hate. There's a time to fight. When he preached so powerfully, he then reached up, took off that long flowing black robe, and there he stood, dressed in full military uniform. He pointed to a young man who began drumming, and he called for recruits. Nearly every man volunteered. Pastor Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg marched off at the head of a company of 300 men. He helped win independence in this country. He was even at Yorktown at the surrender. He continued to serve his country even after the war was over. When he was defending his position, I want you to listen to what he said, because some criticized him for leaving the pulpit for the battlefield. Here's what he said. I'm a clergyman, it is true. But I'm also a member of society as well as the poorest layman. And my liberty is as dear to me as to any man. Shall I then sit still and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the continent is spilling? Heaven forbid it. Do you think if America should be conquered, I should be safe? Far from it. And would you not sooner fight like a man than die like a dog? The cause is just and righteous and noble. Were I a bishop, even a Lutheran one, I should obey without hesitation, and so far from thinking that I am wrong, I am convinced it is my duty to do so, a duty I owe to my God and to my country. I want to ask you, why are most professing Christians so weak, so anemic, so sickly, so worthless? They won't stand. They won't fight. Principle means nothing. They don't even know principle. They don't understand principle. Why are Christians in the position that they're in? And why is America, the citizens here, so ignorant of civil liberty, of biblical principles, of civil government? Why do we put up with what we put up with? Can you imagine what would happen if Thomas Jefferson and George Mason and George Washington and some of those men were alive today? Some of you have seen the bumper stickers. Some of you have seen the T-shirts that just have this on them. Our forefathers would have been shooting by now. And that's the truth. Let me tell you something, folks. The problem that we're in this country, I lay at the feet of the pastors. Because pastors refuse to teach, they refuse to preach, they refuse to stand. And two, part of the problem I understand is the people. Because the people like it like that. Do you understand? If you don't know truth, somehow you tend to think, well, I don't have to obey it. Or I'm not responsible. And you tend to think, well, just so I've got someone that'll preach easy things to me and let me live my life and have my ball games and my color TV and my vacations and my sex, just so they don't disturb me. It was the pulpit that was the cradle of the American liberties. And let me tell you something, folks. We will never get back our history. We will never get back our heritage. We will never get back our liberty. We will never get back our freedom. We will never get back our independence until we get real, genuine pastors back in the pulpit who care more about truth than they do anything else. We've turned our churches into entertainment centers. The church's obligation is not to entertain. The church's obligation is to preach and to teach the truth of God. No matter how hard, no matter how difficult. We have to come back to men like Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg and James Caldwell and Jonas Clark, who say this: who cares about a big building program? Who cares whether or not I'm written up in America Today? Who cares whether or not I'm listed in one of the 500 most successful preachers in America? What I want is truth. And I want my people to know truth. And I want liberty. And I want freedom. You don't have any idea. Well, some of you do. Most of you do. But most people have no idea how far we've sunk in this country. I remember 40-something years ago being in Fairfax, Virginia. And when I discovered that a man could not cut down a tree on his own property without permission from the government, I was horrified. I'd never heard of anything like that. I know one man who had 10 acres of land. He had a mobile home that he paid cash for and put on that 10 acres of land. Somehow, the county found out he did not have a sanitation system in the mobile home. He had one, but it wasn't hooked up. There was no septic system. So the county engineer came out there and said, where are you going to the bathroom? He said, in my woods. He said, I was in the service. I know how to dig a latrine. Well, he said, you can't do that. He said, what do you mean I can't do that? He said, you can't do that. He said, you have to have a septic system. He said, well, I'm willing to get it, but he said, I pay cash for everything. And he said, and I'm going to put one in just as quickly as I have the money to put one in. But he said, you don't understand. You can't live in this mobile home until you get one in. He said, sir, he said, if you're willing to pay for it, I'm willing to put it in today. But he said, I don't have the money and I'm not going into debt. He said, I'm going to pay cash. I will put one in. He said, no, you don't understand. If you don't have one here, you can't live here. And here's what the man said. He said, sir, you mean to tell me that I went to Vietnam, I got wounded, I nearly died, And I came back here and I can't even go to the bathroom in my own woods. He said, sir, you sit right here till I get my rifle out of my closet. He said, I will fix you. And when he got up to go get his rifle, the man left. Now, the point I'm trying to make is very simple. What has happened? Where are we? We're enslaved. And we think our slavery is liberty and freedom. I will tell you this. There are some men here tonight older than I am. But I honestly believe this. I believe that my generation was the last generation that tasted the last little bit of freedom that we really had in this country. What you need to do is this. You need to pray that God will give us pastors. You need to confront your pastor. You need to make sure that he knows that you're praying for him. You need to ask him questions. You need to give him books. You need to teach him history. You need to let him know that there's a vast difference between our founding fathers and the preachers of that time than what we are today. One last thing. I love this. I have a message on it. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, Samuel, that sweet little prophet, you know, the little boy that was given to the Lord by Hannah, his mother, raised in the tabernacle. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, Samuel, the sweet prophet, is going to Bethlehem to offer a sacrifice. And guess what? Before Samuel the preacher gets to Bethlehem, a committee comes out to meet him, and here's the question they ask him. Comest thou peaceably? Well, what a question to ask a preacher. Are you coming peacefully? Can you imagine? Can you imagine a modern day pastor going to a city council meeting or a county council meeting, and before he gets up on the front step, somebody asks, now preacher, are you coming peacefully? Why would they ask Samuel, are you coming peacefully? Well, if you'll read 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel had just taken a sword and hewed Agag the king in pieces before the Lord. And they wanted to know, Samuel, are you coming peacefully? Are you coming to do what's right, or are you coming to harm us? Because we know you're a prophet of God and you have authority. And they wanted to know. You know something, folks? Think about this. Think about this. When I was a boy, and I've seen it 100 times, I was born in the South, lived in the South. A lot of men smoked. A lot of men that went to our church smoked. I have seen grown men smoking cigarettes when I was a boy. And the pastor would walk up to them, and those grown men would take those cigarettes out of their mouth, hold them behind them, and either pinch them out or drop them to the ground and stomp them out. They were not trying to hide them from the pastor. The pastor knew they smoked. But they had enough respect for their pastor, they were not going to blow smoke in his face. You look at what happens day to day, most people will not only blow smoke in your face, they'll cuss you out. The pastor, while they're blowing smoke in your face at the same time. Why? Because there's no respect for ministers as a whole today. Why? Because most ministers have ceased being God's representatives. We need pastors. You need to learn to pray. God, raise up men. God, give us men. God, give us pastors. God, give us pastors that will stand for truth and principle and liberty and freedom. Rise up, you Christian soldiers. Rise. Father, in the name of Jesus Christ, we bow to Thee. We thank You for Your word. We thank You for Your truth. We thank You for these men. Oh, God, give us courage. Give us wisdom. Give us discernment. Give us men, Lord. Raise up pastors that know Thee and know Thy truth and are willing to stand and fight for truth. Help us, Lord, to lead Thy people aright and teach them aright. And give us grace that we may stand before them in Thy power, in Thy authority, with Thy word. In the name of Jesus Christ we ask and pray. Amen.
Amen.